in relationship to Russia and Ukraine. What's been disturbing me most particularly, I would say, is that I don't understand what it is that the West is aiming at precisely. What I see being emitted from the Biden administration, and for the people who are beating the pro-war drum hard, and that would include my idiot government in Canada, is a very banal form of dimwit flag waving, which is, well, the Ukrainians are great Democrats and we're supporting democracy and we're on the side of freedom. And I heard a fair bit of that about Afghanistan, and I heard a fair bit about that in relationship to Iraq, and it isn't obvious to me that that worked out particularly well. And I don't buy the shallow moralizing flag waving. And Ukraine is a country that is so corrupt that it's almost beyond comprehension. And so the idea that there's an easy pathway to democracy there is utterly preposterous, which isn't to say that, no, I'm without my qualms, let's say, on the Russian side. Russia's been a very troublesome country for a good 150 years and probably before that. And so it's not like the situation is straightforward. But here's what I've been walking through in my imagination. And so the hawks that I've talked to on the American side have basically laid out the most reasonable case for war for me, I suppose, and have claimed, for example, that it's in our best interest in the West to keep Russia relatively weak militarily, to minimize the threat they might pose now and in the future. And this war gives us an opportunity to do that, just that, to cull their conventional forces and to keep Russia back on its heels. And so I think it's dangerous to weaken Russia, partly because Russia has natural resources that we actually need, especially natural gas, which produces the ammonia that feeds 4 billion people, and they produce ammonia and they produce food, high quality wheat in particular. And so a devastated Russia doesn't seem to me necessarily in the long-term interests of either the West or the planet. And then on the alternative side, well, let's say Putin is deposed because he loses this war in a conventional sense, and a new leader emerges. The probability, as far as I'm concerned, that we'll get a new leader in Russia in the midst of chaos who's better than Putin is virtually zero, given the historical precedents. And then if we reduce Russia to something like a state of chaos, which also could happen, and the country fragments in the worst case scenario, then we have a situation where we have a fragmented Russia with 25,000 nuclear weapons floating around, let's say. And that also seems like a rather dismal outcome. So, like, what the hell's our plan for victory here, as far as you're concerned?
Look, I think starting out, at least from the U.S. perspective, the idea was first to deter Putin from invading. Once he invaded, the idea was to weaken him and cause him to decide relatively quickly that it wasn't worth the effort and to retreat. With good reason, people in the United States and in many other countries want to make sure that we stop Vladimir Putin. He's a bad guy. He's someone who has ambitions that aren't good. And so everyone sees in him this bad person, which he is, who could do a whole lot of bad things. The problem is, I think we're long past the moment where what we're doing is going to do anything to stop him from aggressing. If anything, we've made it worse. We've driven him into the arms of China. And that loving embrace, that alliance that's resulted from it, economically, with energy, in many respects, ultimately, I think militarily, that could create a much bigger problem than existed prior to the beginning of this war. And so, look, he is a bad guy. I wish he would go away, but I'm not sure that the U.S. involvement in it is necessarily going to inure to the benefit of the American people. And I think we've lost sight of that precisely because of the factor you described. I don't think there is a coherent, cogent game plan and end result of peace that we're trying to get at. Nor do I think that what we've done so far has brought us peace. Quite to the contrary, it's continued the effort.
China has its problems, to say the least. They're facing a demographic collapse. Their real estate market is, to call it shaky, is to say almost nothing. They're actually facing, by Chinese standards, quite the rebellion on the home front. I mean, things don't look that bright for the Chinese Communist Party. And having them ally with Russia I would say, seems to be something that could be in their favor economically, because it gives them access to the immense resources of Russia. And if you think China is a good ally of the West, then you've got another thing coming. Anything that's done to help them survive in their current form, the CCP, in particular the Chinese Communist Party, is definitely not in our best interest. So having Russia establish an alliance with China that helps China limp along into the future, I mean, that's a country that supports North Korea, which is about all you need to say about the Chinese Communist Party. And so that seems like a dim-witted strategy in the long run, especially because China is at least as much of a threat. Now, it's more of a threat in any reasonable sense than Russia should be. I mean, talk about systems out of alliance. We're not allied very well with the Russians, philosophically, let's say, but we are absolutely not aligned with the Chinese. So that seems like a preposterous endeavor. And it's an uneasy alliance between the Chinese and the Russians. It's not a natural alliance. We'd really have to force both the Chinese and the Russians into a corner in some real sense in order for them to be able to hammer out something approximating an agreement. So that seems rather dim-witted. So, and then let's also talk about the cost of war. So first of all, how much money do you think the U.S. has poured into Ukraine so far?
$113 billion to date. $113 billion is an enormous sum of money. This represents a sum of money that's, I think, between 20 and 25 times what Ukraine typically spends on defense in a typical year. This is a sum of money roughly nearly double of what Russia spends on defense in a typical 2-year period. And I believe it's even 30-40% larger than what Russia spent on defense last year, given that, they had a significant war effort going on. What concerns me there, Jordan, is that we're getting into this with our funding and with our contribution of weapons. If we're going to get involved through what could fairly be described by some or perceived by some as a proxy war, we need to understand what our objective is. And in the United States, we're supposed to have a declaration of war before we get involved in that. This becomes especially important when you're dealing with a near-peer, nuclear-armed geopolitical adversary. These guys have got nukes. And to say they've got nukes is a vast understatement. They've got a lot of nukes. And so we've got to be really, really careful when approaching that monster. And I don't think we're showing caution in that regard.